Doug Gilmour wasn't supposed to make it to the NHL. At just 5'10" and 175 pounds, scouts doubted whether he could survive in a league dominated by size and strength. But what he lacked in stature, he made up for with heart, skill, and relentless determination. From being overlooked in the NHL Draft to becoming a Stanley Cup champion with the Calgary Flames and an icon with the Toronto Maple Leafs, Gilmour defied expectations at every turn. Join us as we dive into the incredible career of one of hockey's greatest two-way players, Doug Gilmour. Doug Gilmour was born on June 25, 1963, in Kingston, Ontario, Canada. From an early age, hockey was a central part of his life, but his path to NHL stardom was far from easy. He was the youngest son of Don and Dolly Gilmour, growing up in a working-class family that valued discipline, perseverance, and hard work. His father, Don Gilmour, worked as a correctional officer at Kingston Penitentiary for over 3 decades, an environment that required resilience and mental toughness, traits that would later define Doug's playing style on the ice. But Don wasn't just a prison guard. He was also deeply involved in coaching youth sports, particularly baseball and hockey, instilling in young athletes, including his own son, the values of teamwork and relentless effort. Doug's older brother, David Gilmour, was also a talented hockey player. He was drafted by the Vancouver Canucks in the 1977 NHL Draft, though he never made it to the NHL level. Despite this, David became a role model for Doug, demonstrating the dedication and commitment required to compete at a high level. Watching his brother chase his hockey dreams fueled Doug's own ambition, but he was well aware of the challenges that lay ahead, challenges that would be even greater for him due to one major obstacle: his size. As a child, Doug was always one of the smallest players on his teams. In an era when hockey placed immense value on size and physicality, this became an uphill battle. Time and time again, he was overlooked or cut from teams simply because coaches believed he was too small to compete at an elite level. But what Doug lacked in physical stature, he made up for with intelligence, skill, and an unbreakable will to succeed. He developed a playing style that relied on speed, defensive awareness, and sheer determination. He wasn't just trying to keep up with bigger players, he was outsmarting and outworking them. Throughout his youth hockey career, he faced constant doubts from scouts and coaches who questioned whether he could handle the demands of professional hockey. Even when he played junior hockey with the Cornwall Royals in the Ontario Hockey League, he was still seen as an underdog. But it was during this time that Doug Gilmour began to silence his critics. He led the Royals to back-to-back Memorial Cup championships in 1980 and 1981, proving that his size was not a limitation. In his final junior season, he exploded offensively, scoring an incredible 177 points in just 68 games, a performance that demanded attention. Despite this, when the 1982 NHL Draft arrived, Gilmour was still underestimated. It wasn't until the 7th round, 134th overall, that the St. Louis Blues finally took a chance on him. Even then, many doubted whether he would ever make it to the NHL. But for Doug, being doubted was nothing new. It was just another challenge, one he was more than ready to overcome. His journey to becoming one of the most respected and decorated two-way players in NHL history was just beginning. When Doug Gilmour was finally selected by the St. Louis Blues in the 7th round of the 1982 NHL Draft, it wasn't a moment of triumph. It was yet another reminder of how little faith others had in him. Being drafted so late meant that most teams still believed he was too small to survive at the NHL level, let alone thrive. But for Gilmour, this wasn't discouragement. It was motivation. He had spent his entire life proving people wrong, and this was no different. If anything, it was the perfect scenario. No expectations, no pressure, just an opportunity to do what he had always done. Work harder than everyone else and let his play speak for itself. When he arrived at training camp with the Blues, the odds were still stacked against him. Late-round draft picks were rarely given serious opportunities, and St. Louis had no shortage of forwards competing for spots. But Gilmour's play was impossible to ignore. He was relentless on the ice, a player who never took a shift off. His defensive awareness was far ahead of his years, and despite his size disadvantage, he played with an edge, an almost reckless tenacity that forced opponents to take him seriously. It wasn't long before Blues head coach Jacques Demers took notice. Against the expectations of many, Gilmour not only earned a spot on the roster, but quickly established himself as a reliable two-way forward. In his rookie season, he put up a respectable 53 points in 80 games. More importantly, he proved that he could hold his own in the NHL, using his intelligence and positioning to compensate for his smaller frame. Over the next few seasons, his role continued to grow. His offensive numbers improved year after year, and by the 1986-87 season, he had fully arrived as a top-tier player. That year, he erupted for 105 points, cementing himself as one of the league's elite playmakers. His ability to control the tempo of the game, set up teammates, and shut down opposing stars made him invaluable to the Blues. His breakout season earned him a spot on Team Canada for the 1987 Canada Cup, a tournament that featured the greatest players in the world. Playing alongside legends like Wayne Gretzky and Mario Lemieux, Gilmour was no longer the overlooked underdog. He was one of the best. The Blues now had a legitimate star on their hands, and it seemed like Gilmour was poised to be a centerpiece of the franchise for years to come. But just when it looked like he had finally achieved stability in his career, everything changed. In August 1988, Gilmour was named in a civil lawsuit that sent shockwaves through the hockey world. The lawsuit, filed by the parents of a 14-year-old girl, alleged that Gilmour had engaged in sexual misconduct. The suit also implicated his then-wife, the Blues organization, and team president Jack Quinn, accusing them of either being complicit in or failing to prevent the alleged incident. The Blues, desperate to control the fallout, reportedly engaged in settlement negotiations, but at the same time worked behind the scenes to move Gilmour in a trade without informing the other teams of the ongoing legal battle. Just a week later, on September 6, 1988, the Blues orchestrated a blockbuster deal, sending Gilmour, Mark Hunter, Steve Bozek, and Michael Dark to the Calgary Flames in exchange for Mike Bullard, Craig Cox, and Tim Corkery. The trade blindsided Gilmour, who was still processing the events of the previous week. Though disappointed to leave St. Louis, he later admitted that, given the circumstances, it was the best possible solution for both sides. For the Blues, it was a controversial and desperate move, one that backfired spectacularly. The players they acquired never came close to replacing Gilmour's impact, and the franchise would spend years searching for another player of his caliber. Meanwhile, for Calgary, it was an absolute steal. Freed from the turmoil in St. Louis, Gilmour would go on to redefine his career with the Flames, playing a pivotal role in their pursuit of hockey's ultimate prize. Doug Gilmour arrived in Calgary under difficult circumstances, but it didn't take long for him to turn the page and establish himself as a crucial part of the Flames roster. The team, led by GM Cliff Fletcher and head coach Terry Crisp, was already a legitimate Stanley Cup contender, boasting a deep lineup featuring stars like Al MacInnis, Joe Nieuwendyk, and Theo Fleury. With Gilmour now in the mix, the Flames had an elite two-way center who could be relied upon in all situations, whether it was shutting down the opposition's best players, killing penalties, or providing much-needed offense. From the moment he stepped onto the ice in a Flames uniform, Gilmour's impact was undeniable. His relentless style of play, which had earned him respect in St. Louis, was now being put to use on a team built to win. Over the course of 4.5 seasons, he recorded 81 goals and 295 points in 266 games, consistently delivering in high-pressure moments. But it was in the 1988-89 season that he would etch his name into Flames history forever. That year, the Flames dominated the NHL, finishing first overall in the regular season with a franchise record 117 points. Gilmour played a critical role in their success, providing both offensive production and defensive reliability. However, his true defining moment came in the Stanley Cup playoffs. As the Flames battled through the postseason, Gilmour's contributions became even more crucial. He was one of the team's most consistent performers, and when Calgary reached the Stanley Cup final against the Montreal Canadiens, he stepped up when it mattered most. In Game 6 of the final, with the Flames holding a narrow lead and the championship within reach, Gilmour delivered the moment that Flames fans still talk about today. With just over a minute left in the third period, he sealed the victory with an empty net goal, ensuring that Calgary would claim its first, and to this day only, Stanley Cup title. The image of Gilmour celebrating on the ice, arms raised in triumph, became one of the most iconic moments in franchise history. While Gilmour was celebrating his Stanley Cup victory, the players involved in the trade on St. Louis's side were struggling. Mike Bullard, the centerpiece of the deal for the Blues, lasted just 20 games in St. Louis before being moved again. Craig Cox and Tim Corkery failed to make an impact, and within a short time, it was clear that the trade had been one of the most lopsided in NHL history. Meanwhile, in Calgary, Cliff Fletcher was hailed as a genius for orchestrating the deal. Years later, he would admit that the Flames could not have won the Cup without Gilmour. Though Gilmour's time in Calgary was relatively short, his contributions were undeniable. He had not only helped the Flames reach the pinnacle of the sport, but had also cemented himself as one of the NHL's most dynamic and respected two-way forwards. However, despite his success, the landscape of the NHL was changing, and within just a few years, financial struggles and contract disputes would lead to yet another blockbuster trade, one that would take Gilmour to the biggest hockey market in the world. By the early 1990s, the NHL was undergoing major financial and structural changes. The introduction of higher player salaries and free agency meant that teams, particularly those in smaller Canadian markets, were struggling to keep pace with rising costs. The Calgary Flames, despite being just a few years removed from their 1989 Stanley Cup triumph, were beginning to feel these financial pressures. For a team that had built itself into a powerhouse, the reality of having to make tough roster decisions to stay afloat was setting in. Unfortunately for Doug Gilmour, he was about to become a casualty of this new economic landscape. Gilmour had spent over 4 seasons in Calgary, proving himself as one of the team's most reliable and versatile players. He had been instrumental in their Stanley Cup run and had continued to be one of their top contributors. But despite his value to the franchise, his contract situation had become a growing point of contention. By 1991, he was one of the lowest-paid star players in the league, earning far less than many of his peers despite his consistent production. The Flames' general manager at the time, Doug Risebrough, was reluctant to commit to a significant pay raise, and what started as a contract negotiation quickly turned into an ongoing power struggle. The dispute went beyond just salary. It became personal. Gilmour felt disrespected by the way the team was handling the negotiations, while Risebrough and the Flames management seemed to believe they could strong-arm him into accepting a lesser deal. As tensions escalated, it became clear that neither side was willing to back down. For Gilmour, who had always been known for his tenacity and unwillingness to be pushed around on the ice, that same mindset applied off the ice as well. He wasn't going to be bullied into accepting an undervalued contract, even if it meant forcing a move. Then, in late 1991, an incident occurred that confirmed Gilmour's suspicions that his time in Calgary was coming to an end. During a road trip, he was staying in a hotel when he overheard a conversation coming from the room next door. His general manager, Doug Risebrough, was on the phone, actively discussing trade options that would send Gilmour out of Calgary. It was a brutal realization. Not only was the team unwilling to meet his contract demands, but they were already working on shipping him out. For Gilmour, that was the final straw. On December 31st, 1991, after being named the first star in a victory over the Montreal Canadiens, he returned to the locker room, packed his bags, and made a bold decision. He would not play another game for the Flames until he was traded. It was a dramatic move, but one that made it clear to management that they had no choice but to deal him. Just 24 hours later, on January 2nd, 1992, the trade was finalized. But this wasn't just any trade. It was the largest trade in NHL history. In a shocking deal, the Calgary Flames sent Doug Gilmour, Jamie McCoon, Rick Natraz, Rick Wamsley, and Kent Manderville to the Toronto Maple Leafs. In return, the Flames received Gary Leeman, Michael Petit, Jeff Reese, Craig Berube, and Alexander Godinuk. With 10 players involved, it remains the biggest trade in NHL history in terms of total players moved in a single transaction. At the time, there were mixed reactions to the trade. While it was clear that Gilmour was the biggest piece involved, the Flames believed they were getting a solid return. Gary Leeman, in particular, was expected to be a game-changer for Calgary. He had once been a 50-goal scorer with the Leafs, and Flames management hoped he could rediscover that form in Calgary. Meanwhile, the other players included in the deal were seen as depth pieces who could provide additional support. However, it didn't take long for the hockey world to realize just how one-sided this trade truly was. Lehman never regained his scoring touch, managing just 11 goals in 59 games with the Flames before being traded away again. Petit, Reese, Berube, and Godinuk had minimal impact, and within a short time, it became painfully clear that Calgary had given up far more than they had received. On the other hand, the Maple Leafs had just acquired a franchise-altering player. From the moment Gilmour arrived in Toronto, he completely transformed the team. His leadership, work ethic, and elite two-way play made an immediate impact. Almost overnight, he became the heart and soul of the organization, elevating his game to new heights and carrying the Maple Leafs on his back. In Toronto, Gilmour wasn't just another player. He was about to enter the greatest chapter of his career. Doug Gilmour's arrival in Toronto marked the beginning of a career renaissance, one that would not only elevate his own legacy, but also change the trajectory of the Maple Leafs franchise. Almost overnight, he became the team's most important player, a leader both on and off the ice, and the engine that powered the Leafs to new heights. The doubts that had followed him throughout his career, the questions about his size, his durability, and whether he could truly carry a team, were about to be permanently erased. From the moment he stepped onto the ice in a Leafs uniform, Gilmour played with a fire that instantly made him a fan favorite. He wasn't just a skilled player, he was relentless. He chased pucks with an almost reckless intensity, battled for every inch of ice, and had an uncanny ability to control the tempo of a game. He could shut down the opposition's best players one moment and create a highlight reel play the next. Over the next 2 seasons, he would put up 238 points, finishing second in the NHL in assists both years. A feat made even more remarkable considering he wasn't just an offensive dynamo, but also one of the league's best defensive forwards. His two-way excellence was finally recognized in 1993 when he was awarded the Selke Trophy as the NHL's best defensive forward. By this time, Gilmour was no longer just another star player. He was in the conversation as one of the very best in the world. For a stretch in the early 1990s, many considered him the third best player in the NHL, trailing only the legendary Wayne Gretzky and Mario Lemieux. He wasn't the flashiest player, and he didn't put up Gretzky-like numbers, but what he brought to the ice was arguably just as valuable. He was the ultimate competitor, a player who could tilt the ice in his team's favor every time he stepped onto it. But Gilmour's greatest contributions weren't just measured in individual accolades. They were measured in playoff success. Before his arrival, the Leafs had been a struggling franchise, a team that hadn't won a Stanley Cup since 1967 and hadn't seriously contended in decades. That changed with Gilmour at the helm. In 1993, he led Toronto on a playoff run that remains one of the most cherished memories in franchise history. In the first round, the Leafs faced the heavily favored Detroit Red Wings, a team stacked with talent. But Gilmour's leadership and clutch performances helped Toronto pull off the upset, setting the tone for what was to come. In the second round, he went head-to-head with the Saint, Louis Blues and star goaltender Curtis Joseph in a brutal 7-game series. Joseph at times seemed unbeatable, but Gilmour's playmaking and relentless pressure helped Toronto outlast their former rival. Then came the conference finals against Wayne Gretzky and the Los Angeles Kings. It was a battle for the ages, a dramatic 7-game war that could have gone either way. Gilmour was everywhere, playing heavy minutes, dominating in all 3 zones, and providing the kind of performances that Leafs fans still talk about to this day. Toronto came 1 game away from reaching the Stanley Cup final, but a controversial missed call on Gretzky in Game 6 and his legendary Game 7 performance ended the Leafs' dream run. Although Toronto didn't win the Cup, those 2 playoff runs in 1993 and 1994 redefined the franchise. Gilmour had brought back the passion, the intensity, and the belief that the Leafs could be a true contender again. Even today, Leafs fans look back on that era as one of the most exciting in team history, largely because of what Gilmour brought to the ice every night. He had arrived in Toronto as part of a historic 10-player trade, but by the time he had cemented his legacy, that deal was remembered as one of the biggest steals in NHL history. Calgary had let go of their most valuable player, and in return, Toronto had gained a legend. Gilmour had become more than just the heart and soul of the Maple Leafs. He had become an icon. By the mid-1990s, Doug Gilmour's time in Toronto was coming to an end. The Maple Leafs, who had been on the rise with Gilmour leading the way, were beginning to decline, and the team faced a difficult decision about their aging superstar. On February 25, 1997, Toronto traded Gilmour to the New Jersey Devils, ending what had been one of the most significant and celebrated eras in Maple Leafs history. Though Gilmour's departure was inevitable, it was still a heartbreaking moment for fans who had seen him as the face of the franchise. With the Devils, Gilmour's role shifted. He was no longer the undisputed leader of the team, but instead became a veteran presence on a roster already loaded with defensive-minded stars. He still played with the same intensity that defined his career, but his production had begun to decline. After 2 seasons in New Jersey, he was traded once again, this time to the Chicago Blackhawks, where he would spend 2 more seasons before moving to the Buffalo Sabres for a brief stint. As the years passed, Gilmour's days as a dominant force in the NHL were behind him, but his impact on every team he played for was undeniable. Even in his later years, his leadership, work ethic, and ability to step up in big moments never wavered. He continued to battle against younger, faster competition, refusing to let age slow him down. However, injuries began to take their toll, and as he approached the end of his career, he sought an opportunity to return to where it all began, to Toronto. In 2003, Gilmour signed a 1-year deal with the Maple Leafs, hoping for one last chance to play in front of the fans who had embraced him as one of their own. But in a cruel twist of fate, his return was short-lived. In just his first game back with the Leafs, he suffered a serious knee injury, effectively ending his career. It was not the farewell he had envisioned, but in the eyes of Leafs fans, his legacy had already been cemented long before that moment. Although Gilmour never won another Stanley Cup after his triumph with Calgary, his impact on the game extended far beyond championships. He had carved out a career that few could match, a relentless competitor, a gifted playmaker, and a leader who could elevate an entire team. His influence didn't go unnoticed. In 2011, he was inducted into the Hockey Hall of Fame, a fitting recognition for a player who had defied the odds at every stage of his career. The Maple Leafs, acknowledging his contributions to their franchise, honored him in the most prestigious way possible. On January 31, 2009, they officially retired his number, 93 jersey, ensuring that no other Leafs player would ever wear it again. It was a moment of closure, a final tribute to the man who had given Toronto some of its greatest hockey memories. And while Gilmour's legacy is forever tied to his time in Toronto, the man who had orchestrated both of his legendary trades, Cliff Fletcher, was also recognized for his impact on the sport. In 2004, Fletcher was inducted into the Hockey Hall of Fame, largely because of the franchise-altering deals he made to acquire Gilmour. Looking back, Doug Gilmour's career was defined not just by numbers or awards, but by the way he played the game. He was never the biggest, never the fastest, but he was always the hardest worker. He left everything on the ice, earning the respect of teammates, opponents, and fans alike. For Toronto, he will always be the player who revived a struggling franchise and gave the city a reason to believe again. For Calgary, he will always be the missing piece that brought them a Stanley Cup. And for the hockey world, he will always be remembered as one of the greatest two-way players to ever lace up the skates. Doug Gilmour's journey is the ultimate story of perseverance, resilience, and relentless determination. From being an overlooked draft pick, doubted because of his size, to becoming one of the most dominant two-way players in NHL history, his career was a testament to proving people wrong. He turned his controversial exit from St. Louis into an opportunity, leading Calgary to their first and only Stanley Cup championship. Then, when the Flames underestimated his value, he became the centerpiece of the biggest trade in NHL history and transformed the Toronto Maple Leafs into a legitimate contender. For a time, he was considered one of the best players in the world, second only to legends like Gretzky and Lemieux. His leadership and playoff performances in Toronto remain some of the most cherished memories for Leafs fans, even though he never managed to bring a Stanley Cup back to the city. While the latter part of his career saw him move between teams, his legacy was already secure. His induction into the Hockey Hall of Fame in 2011 and the retirement of his number 93 jersey by the Leafs were just formal acknowledgments of what fans had always known. Doug Gilmour was more than just a great player. He was an icon. His story is proof that greatness isn't always about talent alone. It's about heart, work ethic, and the ability to rise to the occasion when it matters most. And that's why, to this day, Doug Gilmour remains one of the most beloved figures in hockey history. What are your favorite Doug Gilmour moments? Let us know in the comments, and don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more legendary hockey stories.